Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open.
When I was around 12 years old, and even now, I still hate going into basements because of it. It was late at night, probably around 1 in the morning. My parents were not home, or at least they were not nearby enough for me to call for help immediately. I was upstairs by myself, and my dog was outside. I think I was watching John Wick. That detail matters because I had become completely caught up in the movie. I was 12, full of confidence, and convinced that I could handle myself if anything happened. At the time, I was taking karate lessons. I also had a few weapons in the house, including a sword and nunchucks. They were not professional weapons, and I was obviously not some trained fighter, but in my mind, I was prepared for anything. Then I heard a loud thud from the basement. It was not a quiet creak or the sound of the house settling. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I paused the movie and listened. The house became silent. I waited for another noise. Nothing came. The basement was directly below part of the house, and it was large enough that many different things could have caused the sound. Something could have fallen from a shelf. An object might have tipped over near the bar. The fish tank equipment could have shifted. There were normal explanations. But it was 1 in the morning, I was alone, and the sound had been loud enough to make me believe someone might be down there. A sensible 12-year-old would have called a parent, locked the door, and stayed upstairs. Instead, because I had just been watching an action movie, I decided I could investigate. I picked up either the sword or the nunchucks. I honestly cannot remember which one anymore. In some versions of the memory, I see the sword in my hand. In others, I remember gripping the nunchucks. What I do remember clearly is the feeling of carrying something that made me believe I was protected. I walked toward the basement door. The confidence I had felt in front of the television began fading as soon as I reached it. The basement stairs descended into darkness. There was a light switch near the top, but until I turned it on, I could not see what might be waiting below. I stood there for a few seconds, listening. No footsteps, no breathing, no voice. I told myself that if someone had broken into the house, they might already know I was upstairs. Hiding would not necessarily help. I gripped the weapon more tightly and began going down. Each step creaked beneath me. I tried to walk quietly, but the staircase made noise no matter how slowly I moved. The darkness below seemed thick. The basement had always felt larger at night than it did during the day. I knew the layout well, but from the stairs, I could only see black space. When I reached the bottom, I found the light switch and turned it on. The room appeared all at once. My basement was fairly large. There was a television and couch in one section. A bar stood in another area. We also had a fish tank, and there were open spaces between the furniture. During the day, it was a normal family basement. At 1 in the morning, the corners seemed much farther away. I raised the weapon and shouted, "Who's down there?" I tried to sound threatening. My voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Instead of sounding like someone ready to defend the house, I sounded exactly like what I was, a frightened child pretending not to be scared. For a moment, there was no answer. I felt embarrassed, even though I was alone. Then I looked toward the far back corner of the room. A man was standing there. He was extremely tall. He wore a black hat and a long black coat. His body seemed almost completely dark against the corner, but his face was visible enough for me to see that he was smiling. It was not a friendly smile. It looked deliberate and cruel, like he was enjoying the fact that I had found him. The man was so tall that he could not stand upright beneath the basement ceiling. His upper body was bent forward. His neck and shoulders curved under the ceiling as if the room were too small to contain him. I had never seen anyone that tall before. Even now, I cannot guess his exact height. The ceiling was not extremely low, but this man appeared forced to fold himself to fit beneath it. He did not look uncomfortable. He seemed used to standing that way. We stared at each other. I did not move. Neither did he. The weapon in my hand suddenly felt useless. All of the confidence I had gained from the movie disappeared. If this was a real intruder, he was far larger than me. I was 12 years old, standing in an open basement with no easy exit except the staircase behind me. If he rushed me, I would not have had time to fight. For around 10 seconds, we remained completely still. Those 10 seconds felt much longer. I noticed the black hat sitting low on his head. I noticed the long coat hanging from his body. I noticed that his smile did not change. He did not ask who I was. He did not tell me to leave. He did not seem surprised to see me. He only watched. I had the terrible feeling that he had been waiting in that corner before I came downstairs. Maybe the thud had been intentional. Maybe he wanted me to investigate. The thought broke whatever control I had left. I screamed. Then I turned and ran for the stairs. I did not try to use the weapon. I did not threaten him again. I ran as fast as I could. My feet struck the steps hard as I climbed. I expected the man to grab the back of my shirt. I expected to feel a hand around my ankle. I could not hear clear footsteps behind me, but panic made every sound blend together. When I reached the top, I turned to pull the basement door closed. Just before it shut, I looked back. The man was coming up the stairs. He was no longer standing on two legs. He was crawling on all fours. His arms and legs moved quickly beneath the black coat. The position looked completely unnatural for someone so tall. His body filled much of the narrow staircase. He was still looking up toward me. I do not know whether he was still smiling. I remember the black hat, the coat, and the shape of him climbing like an animal. That image has stayed with me more clearly than anything else. I slammed the door. Then I locked it. I stood there with my hand on the lock, expecting the door to shake immediately. I thought he would hit it from the other side. I thought the handle would turn or the wood would bend under his weight. Nothing happened. The basement became silent again. That silence did not comfort me. It made me think he had stopped directly on the other side of the door and was waiting. I knew I could not stay in the house. My dog was still outside, and I did not want to leave without it. I grabbed the leash and went to the door leading outside. Opening another door terrified me because I had no idea whether the man could leave the basement another way. Maybe he was already outside. Maybe he had entered through a basement window and could return through it. I called for my dog. The dog came toward me, and I brought it inside long enough to attach the leash. I remember being relieved when I saw it. Having the dog with me made me feel slightly less alone, although I still did not feel safe. I left the house and went to a friend's home. I do not know how fast I moved or whether I ran the whole way. I only remember wanting distance between myself and the basement. When I reached my friend's house, I woke the family. They were confused and annoyed. I tried to explain that there was a man in our basement. I described how tall he was, how he wore black, and how he had crawled toward me on all fours. They did not believe me. To them, I probably looked like a frightened child who had watched a violent movie too late and scared himself with shadows. I was crying and struggling to speak clearly. That may have made the story sound even less believable. My parents were eventually contacted. They were angry that I had left the house in the middle of the night and woken another family. They did not understand why I had taken the dog or why I refused to return immediately. I told them again that someone had been in the basement. They checked the house. There was nobody there. The basement door was still locked, or at least there was no sign of anyone forcing it open. The windows and outside entrances did not show obvious damage. Nothing seemed stolen. There was no black hat, coat, or evidence that a tall stranger had been hiding in the corner. The basement looked normal. That should have proved that I imagined it, but I knew what I had seen. I had not only caught a quick glimpse of a shadow, I stood under the basement light and looked directly at the man. We locked eyes. I saw the smile. I saw him bending beneath the ceiling. Then I saw him crawling up the stairs. For a long time afterward, I refused to go into the basement alone. Even during the day, the far corner made me uncomfortable. That was where he had stood. I could not look at it without imagining the black coat appearing against the wall again. If someone asked me to get something from downstairs, I tried to convince them to come with me. When I had no choice, I turned on every available light before descending. I checked the corner immediately. I also watched the stairs whenever I left, afraid that the man would appear below me again. Nothing else happened. I never saw him a second time. There were no more loud thuds that I could not explain. The basement door did not open by itself. My dog did not react to anything unusual. The man existed only in that one memory. As I became older, I began considering other explanations. The most obvious one is that I fell asleep while watching the movie. Maybe I dreamed the entire event. I could have imagined hearing a noise, walking downstairs, seeing the man, and escaping. Then perhaps I woke in another part of the house, or became confused, and genuinely believed it had happened. But I remember leaving the house. I remember putting the dog on a leash. I remember waking my friend's family. Those actions happened in the real world. Other people remembered me arriving frightened in the middle of the night. So even if part of the experience was a dream, I must have been awake by the time I left. It is possible I experienced a waking nightmare or hallucination. At 12 years old, late at night, after watching a violent action movie, my brain may have been overstimulated and tired. The loud thud could have been real. When I went into the basement, shadows from furniture might have formed the shape of a person. The black hat could have been an object on a shelf. The coat could have been darkness hanging behind something tall. Once my brain decided a man was standing there, it may have created the face and smile. When I ran, my imagination could have turned a shadow on the stairs into a crawling body. Fear can create convincing images. That explanation makes sense. But the basement light was on. I was not staring into complete darkness. The figures stood in the far corner, but I could see enough detail to identify clothing, posture, and expression. The smile was what frightened me most. A pile of objects might resemble a person, but it is harder to explain seeing a face react. Maybe there was an actual person in the basement. That possibility may be more frightening than a hallucination. Someone could have entered through a window or unlocked door. He might have been homeless, intoxicated, mentally unwell, or trying to hide. A very tall man in a long coat could have stood hunched under the ceiling. When I screamed and ran, he may have chased me on his hands and feet to move faster on the staircase. After I locked the door and left, He could have escaped through the way he entered. By the time my parents checked, he was gone. That explanation accounts for almost everything. It also means I was alone in a basement with a dangerous stranger. I do not know which explanation I prefer. If the man was real, he could have hurt me. If he was not real, then my mind created a person so clearly that I ran from my home and remained terrified for years. Neither possibility is comforting. I have wondered whether the thud came from the man entering. Maybe he fell through a window or knocked something over. But nothing was damaged. There was no broken glass. No furniture appeared moved. Perhaps the thud came from another part of the house and had nothing to do with him. Maybe it simply gave me a reason to go downstairs and discover someone who was already there. I also think about his height. Fear can distort size. A person standing near the back wall may seem larger than he is. The low ceiling and long coat could have exaggerated his body. If he wore a hat, it would add more height. I may have believed he was bending under the ceiling when he was only leaning forward. But the impression was immediate. He looked too large for the room. His shoulders were curved, and his head was tilted because he could not fully straighten. The crawling movement also made him seem less human. A tall person moving quickly up a staircase may naturally lean forward and use his hands for balance. From above, that could appear as though he were running on all fours. I had only a brief view before slamming the door. My frightened mind may have changed the movement into something animal-like. That may be what happened. The image still does not feel mistaken. I remember seeing his hands on the steps. I remember his body low beneath the black coat. I remember the hat remaining on his head as he came upward. Sometimes people ask why I went downstairs at all. The answer is that I was 12. I had been watching John Wick. I was learning karate. I owned a sword and nunchucks. For a few minutes, I believed those things made me capable of protecting the house. Children often understand danger only after facing it. The moment I saw the man, I understood how little control I had. The weapon in my hand could not protect me from something that large. I did not feel like an action hero. I felt like a child who had made a terrible mistake by going into the basement alone. I also wonder why he did not speak. If he was a burglar, he could have threatened me. If he was confused or injured, he might have asked for help. If he wanted to scare me, he could have shouted. Instead, he only smiled. That silence made him seem completely in control. He did not react like someone who had been discovered unexpectedly. He looked as though my arrival was exactly what he wanted. Maybe that interpretation came from fear. A person frozen in surprise might show his teeth or hold an expression that looked like a smile. The basement lighting could have distorted his face. I accept that possibility. But in my memory, the smile was intentional. He enjoyed watching me realize he was there. The 10 seconds we stood facing each other have never faded. I remember the room around him, the television and couch, the bar, the fish tank, all the normal things in our basement. Then the impossible height of the man in the corner. The familiar room made him more frightening. He did not appear in an abandoned building or dark forest. He stood inside my home. Basements already frighten many children. They are below the rest of the house, often colder, darker, and filled with objects adults do not use regularly. Sounds from pipes and heating systems seem louder there. Corners disappear when lights are off. That environment probably influenced what I saw. But I had been in that basement many times. I knew every piece of furniture. I knew what normally stood in the back corner. Nothing there looked like a tall man wearing a hat. After the incident, I sometimes tried standing where he had been. I looked toward the staircase and imagined what he saw. From that corner, a person could watch anyone entering before being noticed. He would have seen me switch on the light. He would have heard my voice crack when I shouted. He would have known immediately that I was a frightened child carrying a weapon I probably could not use. That thought made me stop checking the corner closely. I did not want to imagine him waiting there again. My family eventually treated the experience as an embarrassing childhood story. They remembered me leaving the house and waking my friend. They remembered being angry. They did not remember finding evidence of an intruder. To them, that settled the question. I had scared myself. Maybe they were right. Parents often need a normal explanation because the alternative is admitting that their child may have been in real danger. If they accepted that a stranger had entered the basement, they would have had to ask how he got inside and why no one found him. If they accepted something supernatural, there would be nothing they could do to protect me. It was easier to believe I imagined him. My friend did not believe me either. The story sounded too extreme. A giant man in black standing under the ceiling and crawling upstairs on all fours belongs in a nightmare. But the fear they saw was real. I did not leave home for attention. I did not take the dog and wake another family because I wanted to tell a good story. I believed something was chasing me. Even now, I still feel nervous near basement stairs at night. If I hear a heavy sound below a house, I do not investigate alone. I do not care what weapon is nearby or how harmless the explanation might be. I lock the door and call someone. That is one lesson the experience taught me. The strange part is that I can remember the man more clearly than I remember which weapon I carried. The sword or nunchucks seemed important before I entered the basement. The moment I saw him, they became meaningless. What stayed with me was his face, the hat, the black coat, the way his body bent beneath the ceiling, and the smile. Then, when I ran, the image changed. The tall man who had stood completely still dropped onto all fours. He came up the staircase like an animal. I sometimes wonder whether I truly saw him grab the steps or whether my mind created that detail afterward. Maybe I only saw a dark shape moving upward. Perhaps the coat spread around him, making it look as if he had 4 limbs on the stairs. Memory changes, especially after fear. But the central event has remained the same. I heard a thud. I went downstairs. Someone was standing in the back corner. He was too tall for the room. He smiled at me. Then, he followed me up the stairs. I escaped, locked the door, took my dog, and ran to a friend's house. No one found him. No one believed me. To this day, I cannot prove what happened. Maybe it was a real intruder who escaped. Maybe I suffered a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. Maybe I misunderstood a collection of shadows and furniture. Or maybe something was in that basement that did not belong there. Whatever the explanation, I still do not like going downstairs alone. When I stand at the top of a dark basement staircase, I remember being 12 years old with a weapon in my hand, believing I was brave enough to face anything. Then, I remember the light coming on. I remember the tall man waiting in the corner, and I remember looking back as I closed the door and seeing him crawl toward me on all fours. About a week before we all graduated from high school, one of my friends decided to have a party and bonfire at the top of an old quarry near his house. Calling it a quarry is not completely accurate. There was no water at the bottom, so it was more like a massive empty pit with a high cliff surrounding most of it. From below, the rock walls formed almost 3/4 of a circle, like a giant stone bowl carved into the land. The place was surrounded by thick woods. It was far enough from the nearest houses that we could play music and have a fire without bothering many people. Teenagers from the area occasionally went there to hang out, but reaching it required some effort. My friend's house was about a mile from the entrance to the woods. From there, you had to walk along a trail for another 10 minutes before reaching the bottom of the quarry. Once you arrived, a steep, rocky path followed the left rim of the bowl and eventually climbed to the top of the cliff. It was not an official trail. There were loose stones, uneven ground, and areas where slipping could have been dangerous. To the right of the climbing path was the open quarry and the drop below. To the left was dense forest. That evening, everyone met at my friend's house at around 7. We gathered supplies, talked about what we were bringing, and prepared to leave together. The plan was to walk through the woods as a group before the sun went down completely. Just as everyone was about to go, a woman I was seeing at the time said she needed to get home. I was her ride. I did not want to make the entire group wait for me, so I told them to continue without me. I knew the route well enough and planned to meet them at the quarry. They left while I drove her home. By the time I returned to my friend's house, it was around 7:45. The others had already been gone for a while. I knew the sun would be setting soon, so I did not waste any time. I left my vehicle near the house and started toward the woods. I was wearing jeans and flip-flops, which were not ideal for running a mile or climbing a rocky trail. I had not expected to make the journey alone, and I had dressed for sitting beside a fire rather than hiking. Still, I wanted to reach everyone before it became completely dark. I ran most of the distance from the house to the woods. The flip-flops slapped against my feet, and the jeans made the run uncomfortable, but I kept moving. By the time I reached the trail entrance, I was already breathing heavily. The entrance to the woods looked darker than the open road behind me. There was still some light in the sky, but the trees blocked much of it. The moment I stepped beneath them, evening seemed to arrive faster. I began walking along the trail. I could not run properly because of the roots, rocks, and poor footwear. The trail was familiar, but it required attention even during the day. I moved as quickly as I safely could. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. I could hear insects and the sound of my own steps. Occasionally, a bird or a small animal moved in the brush. Nothing seemed threatening. I was not afraid of the woods, and I knew my friends were somewhere ahead. After about 10 minutes, I reached the bottom of the quarry. The trees opened, and the huge cliff became visible in front of me. There was only a small amount of daylight left, but I could see the shape of the rock walls surrounding the empty center. At the top, I noticed the glow of the fire. My friends had already started it. I could hear music playing faintly above me, the sound weakened by the distance and the shape of the quarry. Seeing the fire made me feel relieved. I had reached the location before complete darkness, and the others were close. All I needed to do was climb the path. The route to the top began along the left side of the quarry. It followed the rim upward, gradually becoming steeper and rockier. I started climbing. The path was only about 4 or 5 feet wide in most places. To my right was the quarry wall, an open drop. To my left was a dense section of forest that seemed to begin immediately beside the trail. The trees were thick enough that I could not see more than a short distance between them. As the remaining daylight faded, the woods became almost completely black. I concentrated on my footing. Loose rocks shifted beneath my flip-flops, and I occasionally had to use my hands to steady myself. I could still hear the music above, which helped guide me. The firelight appeared brighter as I climbed. I knew I was getting close. About 3/4 of the way up, I reached a smaller path branching to the right. This side path led toward the cliff edge, where someone could look over the quarry. In the dim light, I mistook it for the route to the top. The main trail continued upward. But from where I stood, the turn looked as though it might lead more directly toward my friends. I followed it. The smaller path was narrower and moved out toward the open rock. After walking a short distance, I realized it did not continue to the party. It ended at an overlook. From there, I could see my friends above me. The fire burned near the top, and I could make out several people gathered around it. I called to them. I wanted them to know I had arrived and also hoped someone might point out the correct route. They may have heard me, but the music and distance made communication difficult. I turned around and began walking back toward the main path. Nothing had frightened me yet. I was only mildly annoyed with myself for taking the wrong turn. When I returned to the junction, I stepped back onto the main trail. Then I looked downhill in the direction I had come from. About 10 feet below me, something ran across the path. It moved from the quarry side on my right directly into the dense woods on my left. The entire sight lasted perhaps a second. It was tall. It moved on 2 legs. Beyond that, I could only describe it as a blur. It crossed the 4 or 5 foot wide path with incredible speed and disappeared into the trees. I froze. My mind could not immediately understand what I had seen. It was not low to the ground like a deer, dog, or coyote. The shape rose vertically. It had the height and general form of a person, but it moved too quickly for me to identify any clear features. I did not see a face. I did not recognize clothing. I could not tell whether it had hair, fur, or bare skin. There was only the impression of a tall, 2-legged figure moving across the trail. The strange part was where it came from. On the right side of the path was the quarry. There was no normal route from that direction that I knew of. The figure seemed to appear from the rocky side below the trail, crossed directly behind where I had just been standing, and enter the forest. For it to have been there, it must have either climbed up from the quarry or waited near the edge of the path. I had been walking alone below it only moments earlier. The thought struck me immediately. Whatever it was may have been watching me climb. I stood at the junction, staring into the woods where it had disappeared. The trees were completely still. I listened for branches breaking or footsteps moving through the leaves. There was nothing. That silence made the sighting feel even less natural. A large person running into dense forest should have made noise. Branches should have snapped. Dry leaves should have moved. An animal of that size should have disturbed the undergrowth. I heard none of it. I called out, "Is someone there?" My voice sounded small against the quarry and trees. No one answered. I called again, louder. Nothing. The music continued faintly from above, but the forest beside me remained silent. For a few seconds, I considered walking toward the place where the figure entered. Curiosity told me to check. Maybe one of my friends had come down to scare me. Perhaps someone from the party had seen me take the wrong path and hidden below the trail. It would have been the kind of stupid prank teenagers might attempt. But the figure had moved too quickly, and there was something about its shape that stopped me from following. It did not feel like a friend running away after a joke. The fear that came over me was immediate and physical. I had never felt anything like it before. My chest tightened. My arms and legs seemed to become cold. Every instinct told me to get away from the woods. I turned and ran toward the top of the quarry. The path was steep and covered with loose rock, but I no longer cared about falling. I climbed as quickly as possible in flip-flops, using my hands when I needed to. I expected something to come out of the forest behind me. I imagined the figure returning to the path and following. I did not look back. The firelight grew brighter. The music became louder. Then I reached the top and saw my friends. The sight of other people brought immediate relief, but I was still panicked. I went directly to them and told them what had happened. I described the figure running across the trail below me and disappearing into the woods. My friends reacted with a mixture of concern and disbelief. Some thought I was joking. Others suggested it had been an animal. The first thing I did was check who was present. I counted everyone and asked whether anyone had gone down the trail. All of my friends were at the top. No one admitted leaving the party to scare me. No one was missing. They had arrived together, started the fire, and remained nearby. It was still possible one of them was lying, but the timing would have been difficult. For someone from the group to create the sighting, they would have needed to leave the top without being noticed, climb down a dangerous section near the quarry, cross the trail below me, enter the forest, and somehow return to the party before I arrived. I had run the final part of the trail immediately after seeing the figure. There was not enough time for someone to circle around and beat me to the top. I also would have heard them moving through the woods. After checking everyone, I looked back toward the trail. From the top, I could see only a small portion of the path before it disappeared among the rocks and trees. Nothing followed me. The fire and people made the area feel safer, but I could not relax. I kept looking toward the forest. Every movement between the trees made me think the figure was standing there. My friends asked what it looked like. I had difficulty answering. It was tall and moved on two legs. Those were the only details I trusted. Calling it a blur did not mean it was transparent or supernatural. It was simply moving so quickly in poor light that I could not focus on it. It may have been wearing dark clothes. It may have had fur. I do not know. Some friends suggested a deer. A deer can rise tall when seen from the side, and its quick movement may look almost upright for a moment. But I had seen deer before. They run on four legs and have a recognizable shape. This figure moved like a person. Its upper body remained high as it crossed the path. A bear was another possibility. Bears can stand and move briefly on two legs, although they usually drop to all fours when running. A bear crossing the trail would also have seemed wide and heavy, not like the narrow blur I remembered. The area was not known for frequent bear sightings, but one could still have been present. Maybe the darkness distorted its posture. Maybe I saw only part of its body between the rocks and trees. A human being was the most obvious explanation. Someone may have been wandering through the quarry or woods. It could have been another teenager who knew about the party and wanted to frighten us. It might have been a homeless person, hunter or trespasser who did not want to be seen. That possibility should have made me feel better because it was normal. Instead, it frightened me even more. If the figure was a person, then someone had been alone in the woods beside the path while I climbed. He had not called out. He had not asked to join the party. He had remained hidden until I turned away. Maybe he had followed me from the entrance. Perhaps he watched me take the side path and believed I could no longer see the main trail. Then, when I returned unexpectedly, I caught him crossing behind me. That idea still bothers me. A person hiding in the woods could have intentions far more dangerous than an unknown animal. I stayed at the party, but the rest of the night felt different. The quarry no longer seemed like an empty place where only our group was present. The dark forest beside the fire felt occupied. I tried to enjoy myself, but I remained aware of the path and tree line. When someone went to get more wood or stepped away from the group, I watched until they returned. I did not want anyone walking alone. Eventually, we all left together. I made sure I was not the last person on the trail. The walk back through the woods felt longer than the journey in. We had flashlights and several people, but I kept looking toward the places where the beams ended. Nothing appeared. No one followed us. The figure did not show itself again. In the days afterward, I kept replaying the sighting. The sequence was simple. I climbed the main path. I mistakenly turned onto the overlook. I called to my friends. I returned to the junction. Then something crossed the trail 10 feet below me. If I had stayed on the main path instead of taking the wrong turn, our paths might have crossed directly. I may have reached that exact spot at the same moment the figure came from the quarry side. The thought made my mistake feel strangely fortunate. By taking the overlook path, I had delayed myself. Whatever crossed the trail passed below instead of meeting me face to face. I have returned to the quarry since then. I have gone during the day and at night. Part of me hoped to find a normal explanation. I studied the path where the figure had appeared. I looked at the rocks on the quarry side and the forest on the left. In daylight, the area seemed less mysterious. The trail was narrow but visible. The rocky slope could potentially be climbed, although it would not be easy. An athletic person might have reached the path from below. Animals could also move through the area. The dense woods contained game trails and gaps that were difficult to notice in darkness. During later visits, I found nothing unusual. No strange tracks, no hidden shelter, no evidence that someone lived in the woods. Nothing crossed the path. That should have helped me dismiss the experience. It did not. The fact that I never saw it again left me with no way to compare or investigate. I only had the original moment. Over time, I considered whether exhaustion affected me. I had driven someone home, returned, run nearly a mile in flip-flops and jeans, then walked through the woods and climbed a rocky trail. I was tired and breathing hard. The light was fading. Maybe a shadow moved across the path, and my brain turned it into a tall figure. The quarry walls and trees could have created strange visual effects. A bird, branch, or small animal moving close to me might have seemed much larger. Peripheral vision is unreliable, especially at dusk. That is a reasonable explanation. But I looked directly down the path. The figure was not only at the edge of my vision. I saw it cross the full width of the trail. It began on the quarry side and disappeared into the forest. Its movement had a clear direction and shape. I also heard no corresponding sound. Perhaps that silence came from shock. The music above, my own breathing, and the acoustics of the quarry may have covered the noise. I might have been too frightened to process what I heard. Memory often preserves visual details while losing sound. Still, I remember waiting and listening after it vanished. The forest gave me nothing. Another explanation is that one of my friends did prank me and never admitted it. Teenagers can be committed to a joke, especially when someone reacts strongly. Maybe a friend climbed down earlier and hid near the trail. After running into the woods, he used another route to return to the top. If the terrain allowed a shortcut I did not know about, it could have been possible. But I checked everyone almost immediately. They were all there and did not appear tired from running through dense forest. No one laughed in the way people do when hiding a successful prank. Several seemed genuinely concerned. Years later, nobody confessed. I also knew most of them well enough to recognize their size and movement. The figure seemed taller than my friends. It did not move like someone I knew. It may have been a stranger. The quarry was not private property in the strictest sense, and other people could access it. Someone may have heard the music and approached the party. When he saw me alone, he hid. Perhaps he was embarrassed or afraid of being confronted. Maybe he ran into the forest to avoid us. That explanation accounts for the human shape and silence. It also creates the most disturbing question. How long had he been there? The path from the woods entrance to the quarry took about 10 minutes. I had walked it alone while the light faded. If the stranger was moving in the same direction, he could have followed me the entire way. I would not have heard him if he stayed far enough behind. Once I began climbing, he might have moved along the lower quarry edge. When I turned onto the overlook, he attempted to cross the trail unseen. I returned too soon and caught him. If that is what happened, I am glad I ran. I do not know what he wanted. There is also the possibility that it was an animal I simply failed to identify. That is probably the most likely answer. The world contains strange-looking animals, especially when they are sick, injured, or seen under poor lighting. A deer moving uphill could appear upright. A large dog jumping across the path might briefly show only its rear legs and torso. A bear could rise as it climbed. The two-legged appearance may have lasted less than a second. My mind could have completed the rest. Yet the fear I experienced did not feel like confusion over an animal. It felt like recognition without understanding. I saw something shaped like a person, but some part of me believed it was not one. That instinct is difficult to explain scientifically. Fear does not prove anything supernatural. The body can react strongly to ordinary threats. In fact, a hidden human being may create a stronger instinctive response than a wild animal because human movement is familiar enough for us to notice when something is wrong. Maybe I saw a person running with an unusual posture. The speed, darkness, and silence made him seem inhuman. I have wondered what would frighten me more if I learned the truth. If it was some unknown creature, then something moved through those woods that I cannot name. It was tall, fast, and comfortable near the edge of a quarry after dark. I had been alone in its territory. If it was a person, then a stranger may have followed me through the forest and hidden beside the path. He could have attacked me without anyone seeing. My friends were close enough for me to hear their music, but they would not have known I was in danger until it was too late. The supernatural explanation is frightening because it changes what I believe can exist. The human explanation is frightening because it is completely possible. Sometimes I think the figure had been standing near the quarry side of the path, waiting for me to pass. Maybe it was not running away from me. Maybe it was changing position. It could have crossed into the woods so it could follow from cover. That thought came to me later and made the memory worse. At the time, I assumed it disappeared because it was frightened or did not want to be seen. But I never saw which direction it traveled after entering the forest. The woods ran beside the path all the way toward the top. It could have moved parallel to me while I climbed. It may have been only a few yards away when I reached my friends. There is no evidence that happened. Nothing else appeared, and nobody was harmed. But the possibility remains. The event has become one of those experiences I revisit whenever people discuss strange encounters in the woods. I describe what I saw honestly. A tall, two-legged blur crossed a narrow path 10 feet below me at dusk. I did not see a face. I did not hear a voice. I cannot prove it was anything unusual. I only know the fear was unlike anything I had felt before. It was not the ordinary fear of being alone in the dark. It was the feeling that something had been close to me without my knowledge. The quarry amplified that feeling. The cliff on one side and the dense trees on the other left very few places to escape. The path was narrow. Whatever crossed it had moved between two environments that were both dangerous for me to follow. If it went toward the quarry, I risked falling. If it went into the forest, I would lose sight of it immediately. The figures seemed to understand the land better than I did. I returned several times because curiosity remained stronger than fear once daylight came. I wanted to see it again under conditions that would allow me to identify it. I never did. The quarry was always empty except for normal wildlife and other visitors. The path remained only a path. No trace marked the place where the figure crossed. Years have passed, and I still picture the same moment. I'm standing at the junction after returning from the overlook. The last light is fading above the quarry. My friend's fire glows at the top. Music reaches me faintly. I look down the path. 10 feet away, something tall runs from the open rock into the trees. It crosses so quickly that my mind cannot catch its shape. Then the forest is still. I call out. No one answers. I run to the top and find every one of my friends already there. I wish I knew what I saw. A deer, bear, stranger, or shadow would all be easier to accept if I had evidence. Instead, I am left with the movement, the silence, and the fear. I still cannot decide which possibility is worse. Maybe something unknown lived near that quarry and watched me climb alone. Or maybe it was only a person hiding in the woods, following me in the dark. I was 16 years old when this happened, and more than 15 years later, I still have no explanation for it. It was late at night, just before bed. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth, following the same routine I followed every evening. The flat was quiet. My parents were somewhere else inside, and my brother and I shared a bedroom at the opposite end of a long corridor. The bathroom door opened directly into that corridor, so anyone standing outside it would have been only a few feet away from me. The lights were on. There were no dark rooms, strange shadows, or poor visibility that could have caused confusion. I was standing in front of the sink, looking into the mirror and brushing my teeth, when I heard my brother outside the bathroom door. He spoke in a loud whisper. "Vicorge, quick, come here." I recognized his voice immediately. There was nothing uncertain about it. It did not sound similar to my brother or vaguely like him. It was his voice, using the same tone and way of speaking he always used. He sounded urgent. I assumed he wanted to show me something before our parents noticed, or perhaps he had found something funny and did not want to shout through the flat. Because I was still brushing my teeth, I told him to wait. I expected him to either leave or explain what he wanted. Instead, he repeated himself. "Vicorge, quick, come here." He was still whispering loudly, and he still sounded as though he were directly outside the bathroom door. I became slightly annoyed. Whatever he wanted could wait a few seconds. I had toothpaste in my mouth, and I was almost finished. I told him to wait again. There was a brief pause. Then the voice came for a third time. "Vicorge, quick, come here." The words were exactly the same. The tone was urgent but controlled, as though he did not want anyone else to hear him. By that point, I was irritated. My brother knew I was in the bathroom. He knew I could not answer properly while brushing my teeth. The fact that he continued repeating the same sentence felt childish and impatient. I finished as quickly as I could, rinsed my mouth, and opened the door. I opened it almost immediately after the third whisper. There was no one outside. The corridor was empty. At first, I did not feel afraid. I assumed my brother had run away to annoy me. That seemed like the obvious explanation. He had called me 3 times and then disappeared just before I opened the door, probably expecting me to follow him. I stepped into the corridor. I looked in both directions. There was nowhere nearby for him to hide. The corridor was long and straight, with the bathroom at one end and our bedroom at the other. The lights were on, so I could see the entire distance clearly. I should have seen him running away. I should have heard his footsteps. The floors were not silent. Anyone moving quickly through the flat would have made noise, especially at night when everything else was quiet. But I had heard nothing. I was still more angry than frightened. I thought he had somehow slipped away without me noticing. I stormed down the corridor toward our bedroom. As I walked, I called out loudly, "What?" There was no answer. I reached the bedroom and entered. My brother was in bed. He was tucked under the blankets up to his chin. Headphones covered his ears, and music was playing loudly enough that he had not heard me approach. He looked completely relaxed. He was not out of breath. He was not trying to hide a smile. He did not look like someone who had just run the full length of the corridor and jumped beneath the covers. I stood in the doorway, still expecting him to admit he had been joking. He noticed me, pulled off his headphones, sat up, and looked confused. "What?" he asked, the same word I had just shouted at him. His reaction stopped me. I asked what he had wanted. He stared at me as though he had no idea what I was talking about. I told him that he had been outside the bathroom door calling me. He denied it immediately. He said he had been in bed listening to music. I thought he was lying. That was the only explanation that made sense. I accused him of trying to scare me. He continued looking confused. I asked again whether it was a joke. He shook his head. That was when the fear began. My brother has never been good at lying. When he tries to hide something, it shows immediately. He changes his expression, avoids eye contact, or starts laughing. He is also sensitive. If he had been playing a joke and then saw how frightened I was becoming, he would have admitted it. He would not have continued pretending after realizing I was genuinely upset. But he did not look guilty. He looked concerned. I felt all the warmth leave my body. The blood seemed to drain from my face, and a cold feeling moved through me from my chest outward. I started crying. My reaction frightened my brother, too. He sat up fully and asked what had happened. I tried to explain that I had heard him clearly. Not once, 3 times. The voice had been directly outside the bathroom door. It had called my name. It had told me to come quickly. He kept saying he had never left the bed. The more he denied it, the worse I felt. If it was not him, then I did not know who had spoken to me. There were other people inside the flat, but the voice did not belong to my parents. It belonged to my brother. The sound, rhythm, and pronunciation were exactly right. I had lived with him my entire life. I knew his whisper. I knew the way he said my name. I knew the specific tone he used when he wanted my attention without alerting our parents. Whatever stood outside that bathroom door had copied him perfectly. My parents eventually became involved because I was crying and visibly shaken. I told them what happened. They tried to calm me and offered normal explanations. Maybe I had imagined the voice. Maybe I had heard my brother speaking from the bedroom, and the sound traveled down the corridor. Perhaps the television or another device made a noise that resembled words. Maybe I was tired, and my brain created the voice. Those explanations did not fit. My brother had been listening to music through headphones. He had not called for me from the bedroom. Even if he had, his voice would have sounded distant. What I heard was close. The whisper seemed to come from the other side of a thin bathroom door. There was no echo or distortion. It was as though his face was only inches from the wood. The repeated sentence made it harder to dismiss as random noise. A pipe can make a sound that briefly resembles a word. Music from another room can create the impression that someone said your name, but I heard a complete sentence. Vicorch, quick, come here. Then I heard it again, then a third time. Each repetition was clear. Each sounded like my brother. I had even responded between them. The voice seemed to react to the fact that I was not coming. When I told it to wait, it called again. That interaction made it feel real. I was not lying in bed, half asleep. I was standing upright, brushing my teeth. I was awake enough to become annoyed, answer several times, rinse my mouth, and open the door. There was no transition between sleep and waking, no missing time, no dreamlike changes in the flat. Everything happened in a normal sequence. That is why the experience stayed with me. If it had happened while I was falling asleep, I could blame a dream. If I had heard the voice only once, I could blame the pipes or music. If my brother had been standing in the corridor laughing when I opened the door, it would have been an ordinary prank. Instead, the hallway was empty, and my brother was already in bed. The timing was impossible. I opened the door only seconds after the final whisper. For my brother to have created the voice, he would have needed to run down the full corridor, enter our bedroom, climb into bed, pull the blankets up to his chin, place the headphones over his ears, start the music, and make himself appear completely relaxed. He would have needed to do all of that without me hearing him. The corridor was long. The lights were on. I stepped outside almost immediately. There was no hidden doorway he could have used, no shortcut, no place where he could have waited until I passed. It could not have happened. I have replayed the sequence many times. Maybe more time passed between the whisper and opening the door than I remember. Fear can distort time. What felt like 2 seconds might have been 20, but even 20 seconds would have been difficult. I was angry and trying to confront him. I did not stand in the bathroom thinking for a long time. I rinsed quickly and opened the door, and I should still have heard him running. Maybe he had never been outside the bathroom. Perhaps the sound traveled from the bedroom in an unusual way. Buildings can create strange acoustics. Pipes, vents, and hallways can make voices seem closer or come from the wrong direction. My brother might have called me earlier and forgotten, but he had headphones on and was surprised to see me. He also denied speaking at all. His voice would have needed to travel from the bedroom, down the long corridor, and somehow sound as if it were directly against the bathroom door. It would also need to remain loud enough for me to understand every word. That seems unlikely. My parents believed I imagined it. I understand why. There was no person in the hallway. My brother denied speaking. Nothing else unusual happened that night. The easiest explanation was that my mind created the voice. Auditory hallucinations can happen to healthy people. Stress, tiredness, anxiety, and lack of sleep can cause someone to hear a familiar voice briefly. People sometimes hear their name called when nobody is there. The brain is especially good at recognizing voices we know well. Perhaps I heard a combination of normal household sounds, and my mind turned them into my brother's whisper. But it happened 3 times. The words remained the same. The voice sounded urgent and intentional. I responded, and it repeated itself. I was not particularly tired or stressed, at least not that I remember. I was only brushing my teeth before bed. There was no reason for my mind to create such a specific interaction. Another explanation is that my brother played the joke and has continued lying for more than 15 years. I have asked him about it many times. He always gives the same answer. He was in bed. He had his headphones on. He never called me from the hallway. His reaction has never changed. Even now, when we are adults and there would be no reason to maintain the joke, he swears it was not him. If he admitted it today, I would probably feel relieved. I might be angry that he allowed me to remain frightened for so long, but at least I would have an explanation. He has nothing to gain by continuing the lie. He knows how much the memory affected me. He still denies it. That leaves me with a question I do not like asking. What was outside the bathroom? I did not see anyone. I only heard the voice. Maybe there was never a physical figure in the corridor. Perhaps whatever caused the sound did not need a body. The thought sounds supernatural, and I do not claim to know that is what happened. But if something wanted me to open the door, it used the perfect voice. It sounded like the person I trusted most in the flat. It did not whisper something threatening. It told me to come quickly. That urgency was designed to make me act before thinking. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door the first time. The voice called 3 times because I kept telling it to wait. Maybe it expected me to follow immediately. If I had stepped into the hallway after the first whisper, would I have seen anything? Would there have been someone standing there? Would the corridor still have been empty? The fact that it asked me to come here bothers me. It did not call for help. It did not explain what was wrong. It only wanted me to leave the bathroom and enter the corridor. Perhaps there was no intention behind it. Maybe the sentence came from my own mind because it was something my brother might normally say. Still, it feels like an invitation. There are stories from many cultures about voices copying family members. People describe hearing a parent call from another room when that parent is not home. Some hear their child crying from outside the house while the child is asleep beside them. Others hear their own voice repeated from a dark area. I did not know those stories at the time. I learned about them much later. Hearing them did not prove anything, but they made my experience feel less isolated. The details are often similar. The voice is familiar. It calls from a place the listener cannot immediately see. It asks the person to come closer. When the listener checks, no one is there. Some people call these mimics. Others believe the experiences are caused by memory, acoustics, or the brain misinterpreting sound. I do not know which explanation is correct. I only know that the voice outside the bathroom copied my brother perfectly. For a long time afterward, I became nervous when someone called me from another room. I would answer first and wait for a response. Sometimes I checked where the person was before following the voice. If my brother called me, I wanted to see him. I did not trust the voice by itself anymore. The bathroom also felt different after that night. Every time I brushed my teeth before bed, I remembered the whisper. I would look at the door and wonder whether I might hear it again. I sometimes kept the door open so I could see the corridor. Other times, I locked it, although a lock would not have protected me from a voice with no visible source. Nothing similar ever happened again. I did not hear my brother call from an empty room. No one whispered outside the bathroom door. There were no footsteps or figures in the corridor. It was one isolated event. That makes it easier to dismiss, but harder to investigate. If it happened repeatedly, I could record the hallway or check the acoustics. I could compare the sound with my brother's real voice, but it happened once, late at night, and left no evidence. All I have is memory. Memory can change. More than 15 years have passed. Perhaps the corridor was shorter than I remember. Maybe the door was open longer. Perhaps my brother's headphones were not on when I first entered the bedroom. Small details can shift over time. But the central moment has never changed. I heard him outside the bathroom. He called my name 3 times. I opened the door. No one was there. I found him in bed with music playing. He had no idea why I was asking what he wanted. My emotional reaction also remains clear. I did not become frightened while inside the bathroom. I became annoyed. That matters because I was not already expecting something supernatural. I did not interpret the voice as a ghost or intruder. I believed it was my brother. The fear only came after I saw him in bed and realized the timeline did not make sense. My body reacted before I could create an explanation. I went cold. I began crying. I knew immediately that something was wrong. My brother's confusion frightened me more than any prank could have. If he had laughed, the whole event would have ended. Instead, he looked at me as though I was the one behaving strangely. To him, I'd suddenly entered the bedroom shouting, "What?" while he listened to music. He had no memory of calling me. From his perspective, nothing unusual had happened until I appeared. That difference between our experiences remains unsettling. I heard a full interaction. He experienced none of it. It was as though the voice existed only for me. Maybe that is exactly what happened. An auditory hallucination would be private. My brain could have produced my brother's voice without him hearing anything. The fact that the voice used my name and a familiar sentence would make sense because the mind builds hallucinations from known information. That is the explanation I try to accept. It is reasonable. It does not require anything supernatural. But even that explanation is disturbing. If my own mind created the voice, it did so perfectly enough to make me argue with it. I trusted it completely. I believed a person stood only inches away. That means our senses can create experiences that feel as real as anything outside us. There is no way to protect yourself from a sound when it comes from your own brain. Still, I cannot fully believe it was imaginary. The voice had position. I could tell exactly where it came from. It was not inside my head or distant in the flat. It was outside the door, at the height where my brother's mouth would have been. The volume was controlled, like someone trying to whisper loudly enough for me to hear without waking others. It sounded physical. It sounded present. My brother remains skeptical, but he does not accuse me of lying. He knows I believed what I heard. When the story comes up, he repeats that he was in bed and never left the room. He remembers my face and the way I started crying. That is his evidence that something frightened me, even if he does not believe the voice was real. My parents still think I imagined it. They may be right. I do not expect anyone to believe in something based only on one person's memory. But I know the difference between a vague noise and my brother speaking. I heard him clearly. More than 15 years later, I can still hear the sentence in my mind. "Vicorge, quick, come here." The first time, it sounded urgent. The second time, impatient. The third time, exactly the same voice waiting directly outside the bathroom door. I opened it almost immediately. The corridor was empty. At the other end of the flat, my brother was tucked into bed with his headphones on, completely confused by my question. He still swears he never called me, and I still do not know what did.
We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal.
When I was about 7 years old, I spent the night at my brother's girlfriend's house. We had family photographs scheduled for the following morning, so my brother wanted me to get enough sleep and be ready early. Because I was the youngest person there, He put me to bed on the couch long before he and his girlfriend went upstairs. The house was unfamiliar to me, but the layout was simple. The couch faced the television and the computer desk. The computer sat across the room, close enough that I could see it clearly from where I was sleeping. To the left was the kitchen, and the staircase leading to my brother's room began there. I knew my brother and his girlfriend were upstairs. Even though I was sleeping alone in the living room, they were not far away. That made me feel safe enough to fall asleep. I do not remember what time they put me down or how long I slept. I only remember waking suddenly to the sound of tapping. It was not quiet tapping. It was aggressive and constant, like someone striking the keys of a computer keyboard as hard and as quickly as possible. The sound filled the living room. Tap, 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 tap. There was no pause between the keys. At first, I stayed beneath the blanket and listened. I was confused more than frightened. I wondered why anyone would be using the computer so loudly in the middle of the night, especially when I was sleeping only a few feet away. I sat up on the couch. Someone was standing at the computer. In the darkness, I believed it was my brother. He had the same general height, body shape, and clothing. From behind, there was nothing that immediately made me think it could be anyone else. I assumed he had come downstairs after putting me to bed and decided to use the computer. That annoyed me slightly. He had told me to sleep because we needed to wake early, yet he was making enough noise to wake the entire house. The only light in the room came from the computer monitor. The pale glow surrounded the figure and showed part of the desk, keyboard, and floor. Everything beyond that small area remained dark. The person at the computer looked a little strange, but I did not focus on it immediately. At 7 years old, I trusted what I thought I knew. My brother was upstairs. Now, someone who looked like him was at the computer. Therefore, it had to be him. I pushed the blanket aside and climbed off the couch. The tapping continued. The figure did not turn around when I sat up. He did not react when my feet touched the floor or when I began walking toward him. He kept striking the keyboard. The closer I moved, the louder and more unnatural the typing sounded. It did not have the rhythm of someone writing a message or searching for something. He was not pausing to read what he had entered. He was only pressing keys. When I reached the desk, I looked at the monitor. The computer was still on the login screen. My brother was not writing an email, playing a game, or using the internet. He was entering random letters, numbers, and symbols into the password field. The characters appeared and disappeared as he continued pressing the keys. There was no attempt to enter a real password. There was no purpose behind what he was doing. He seemed interested only in making the keyboard produce noise. I stood beside him and asked, "What are you doing?" He did not answer. He did not slow down. His fingers kept moving across the keys. That was when the room began to feel different. A heavy sensation settled over everything. The air seemed thicker, as though the house had become smaller around me. The darkness beyond the computer light looked deeper than it had when I woke. I felt that something was wrong before I understood why. The figure's posture did not look natural. He stood too still, except for his hands. His shoulders did not shift with the movement of his arms. He did not breathe heavily despite typing with so much force. He had not acknowledged me at all. My brother could be difficult when tired, but he would not normally ignore me while I stood directly beside him. I said something else, possibly his name. He still did not respond. I reached toward his arm. I thought touching him would make him stop and look at me. My fingers were almost against him when the typing suddenly ended. The room became silent. The figure turned his head toward me. He moved slowly. The rest of his body remained facing the computer while his face came around in my direction. That was when I realized it was not my brother. It had his body. It may even have had parts of his face. But the person looking at me was not him. The expression was the most evil thing I had ever seen. I still have difficulty describing it because normal human faces are not supposed to make that expression. It looked as though he was smiling and snarling at the same time. The mouth was stretched into a grin, but there was no happiness in it. The lips and teeth looked tense, like an animal warning something away. His eyes were wide open. They appeared red in the light from the monitor. Maybe the color came from the darkness, the screen, or my fear. I only know that they did not look like my brother's eyes. They stared directly into mine. For 1 second, I felt that whatever was behind that face hated me. It did not seem surprised that I had approached. It looked pleased that I finally understood it was not my brother. I could not move. I could not scream. The figure held the expression for only a moment. Then it began to disappear. It did not run away or drop beneath the desk. Its body seemed to fade into the darkness surrounding the computer. The edges became less clear first. The black room appeared to move through it until there was no longer a solid person standing there. The face remained visible slightly longer than the rest. Then, that disappeared too. At the same moment, the computer shut off. The monitor went completely black. The living room was left in darkness. I remained beside the desk, frozen. Only seconds earlier, I had believed I was standing next to my brother. Now, I was alone. I could no longer see the keyboard, chair, or anything around me clearly. The sudden silence felt worse than the aggressive tapping. I listened for movement. I expected the figure to speak from somewhere behind me. I imagined it standing beside the couch, waiting for me to turn. Nothing happened. I do not know how long I remained there. It may have been only a few seconds, but the fear made it feel much longer. Eventually, I remembered that my real brother was upstairs. I turned away from the computer and ran toward the kitchen. The stairs were dark, but I climbed them as quickly as I could. I did not look back toward the living room. I expected to hear the keyboard start again behind me. I imagined the tapping following me up the stairs, moving from the computer keys to the walls and steps. The house remained quiet. When I reached the top, I hurried toward my brother's bedroom. The door was closed. I raised my hand to knock, then stopped. My brother was terrible when someone woke him. He slept heavily and became extremely angry if disturbed. Waking him could turn into a major argument, even if there was a good reason. At 7 years old, that was enough to make me hesitate. Part of me worried that he would not believe me. I imagined knocking and telling him that something downstairs looked like him. He might laugh, become angry, or order me back to the couch. Then I would have to return to the living room alone. I could not do that. I stood outside the bedroom door and tried to decide what to do. The hallway upstairs was quiet. I paced back and forth. I listened for any sound from downstairs. Every few seconds, I thought I heard a keyboard key being pressed or a floorboard moving, but nothing clear followed. I wanted to knock. Then I remembered my brother's temper and lowered my hand. I considered sleeping on the floor outside his door. At least I would be close to him. But I was afraid that the thing downstairs might climb the steps and find me in the hallway. I did not know whether it had disappeared or merely stopped showing itself. The fact that it had copied my brother made it seem intelligent. It had chosen a person I trusted. It had allowed me to walk close enough to touch it. Then it showed me what was behind the disguise. That did not feel accidental. For what seemed like 20 minutes, possibly longer, I remained outside the bedroom. I tried to convince myself I had dreamed the entire thing. Maybe I had woken only partly and walked through the house while still asleep. Perhaps the computer had been left on, and the screen created shadows that looked like my brother. The tapping could have come from something else. Maybe I never left the couch at all and was still dreaming. But I felt awake. I remembered the cold floor beneath my feet. I remembered seeing the random symbols on the login screen. I remembered reaching for the figure's arm. Most clearly, I remembered the expression. I had never imagined a face like that before. Finally, my fear of staying alone became stronger than my fear of waking my brother. I knocked. At first, there was no answer. I knocked again, louder. My brother woke and opened the door, irritated and half asleep. Seeing him standing there made me feel both relieved and terrified. It was really him. His face looked normal. His eyes were tired, not red. He was confused about why I was outside the bedroom. That confirmed that the person downstairs could not have been him. I tried to explain that I had become frightened and did not want to sleep on the couch. I do not remember whether I told him every detail at that moment. I may have been too upset to describe the figure clearly. He did not go downstairs to investigate. Instead, he told me I could sleep in the room across from theirs. The spare room was messy, but I did not care. There were clothes and other items around, and the bed may not have been prepared for anyone. It was still better than returning to the couch. I entered the room and climbed onto the bed. Almost immediately, the heavy feeling left. The darkness in that room felt normal. I no longer believed something was watching from every corner. My brother and his girlfriend were directly across the hall, and I could call for them if anything happened. I pulled the blankets around myself and listened. The computer did not turn on again. There was no more tapping. Nothing came up the stairs. Eventually, I fell asleep. In the morning, the house looked completely ordinary. Sunlight reached the living room. The computer stood where it always had. There was no sign that anyone had used it during the night. No strange symbols remained on the screen. There were no marks on the keyboard or floor. My brother had been upstairs the entire time. If I told the story that morning, I do not remember how the adults responded. They may have assumed I experienced a nightmare. I was 7 years old, sleeping in an unfamiliar house, and separated from the people I knew. That is the most reasonable explanation. Children often have vivid dreams when sleeping somewhere new. I may have heard a real sound from the house and incorporated it into a nightmare. A pipe, appliance, or object moving could have become the aggressive keyboard tapping. My mind may have used my brother's appearance because he was the person responsible for me that night. The frightening face could have been the moment the dream turned into a nightmare. Then I woke fully near the couch or staircase and went upstairs. That explanation would account for the impossible parts. Dreams can feel completely real. They can include familiar rooms in accurate detail. A person may believe they stood, walked, and spoke when they never moved. The transition between dreaming and waking can be so smooth that the dream becomes stored like a real memory. Maybe I was never beside the computer. Maybe I never touched the figure. But the memory does not feel like a dream. Most childhood nightmares faded quickly. This one remained clear. I remember the layout of the room. I remember the monitor light. I remember the figure pressing random keys while the login screen remained open. I remember asking what he was doing. The sequence was ordinary until the face turned. There were no strange dream changes before that. The house did not become a different place. The stairs did not move. Nothing impossible happened except the person at the computer. Another possibility is that my real brother had gone downstairs. Maybe he was using the computer and wanted to frighten me. He could have entered random characters, made a face, then switched off the monitor and moved away while my eyes adjusted to the darkness. At 7 years old, I might have believed he vanished. He then could have returned upstairs before I knocked on the door. That would be a simple explanation. But I do not remember him moving away. I watched his body disappear where it stood. The computer shut off at the same moment. If he ran past me, I should have heard or felt him. He also would have needed to get upstairs and into bed while I was climbing the same staircase. There was no other route that I knew of. His reaction when I woke him also seemed genuine. He was asleep and irritated, not pretending. I have never believed it was a prank. Perhaps the figure was someone else in the house. My brother's girlfriend or another person could have stood near the computer in the darkness. At that age, I may have mistaken the body for my brother's. But the person looked like him closely enough that I walked directly toward him without hesitation. The figure was not merely similar in height. My mind recognized my brother, and the face that turned toward me seemed like a corrupted version of his. That is what frightened me. It was familiar enough to bring me close, then wrong enough to make me understand I had been deceived. I have also considered whether the computer caused some kind of illusion. The monitor light may have reflected red into the eyes. Screen shadows can distort a face, especially when the rest of a room is dark. Someone smiling could appear to snarl if lit from below or from the side. When the monitor switched off, the person would seem to vanish instantly because my eyes could not adjust. That is how stage illusions work. Light reveals something, then darkness hides it. But who was standing there? That question remains. No one admitted using the computer. My brother was upstairs. Even if the disappearing effect was caused by the monitor, there still had to be a person in front of it. Maybe someone entered the house. An intruder could have been using the computer or trying random passwords. When I approached, he made a threatening expression to frighten me, switched off the monitor, and escaped while I ran upstairs. That possibility may be worse than a ghost. A stranger could have been standing in the living room while a 7-year-old slept on the couch. He might have looked roughly like my brother in the darkness because I wanted to believe I was safe. When I touched him, he turned and revealed his real face. But an intruder would probably have reacted differently. He might have fled, threatened me, or covered my mouth to stop me from calling for help. He would not have disappeared silently before my eyes. There was also no sign of anyone entering or leaving. The computer was on a login screen, not open to private files or anything useful. Randomly attacking the keyboard made no sense for a burglar. The action felt like imitation. It was as though the figure understood that people used the computer but did not understand why. It copied the movement without entering meaningful words. That detail bothers me more as an adult than it did as a child. At 7, I only knew the typing looked strange. Now I think about something wearing my brother's appearance and performing a human action incorrectly. It stood at the computer because that was something a person might do. It pressed the keys because that was how a computer was used. But it did not know the password or care what appeared on the screen. Maybe it wanted the noise to wake me. The tapping was too aggressive to be accidental. It continued until I approached. Once I was beside it, it stopped. That sequence makes it feel as though I was being called toward the desk. The figure could have remained still and hidden. Instead, it created a sound impossible to ignore. It looked like my brother, because I would trust him. Then it waited for me to come close. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had actually touched its arm. My hand was reaching toward it when it turned. Did it stop me intentionally? Would it have felt solid? Would it have felt cold? Would the disguise have remained if I touched it? I am glad I never found out. The expression seemed designed to frighten me away. That may have been all it wanted. Maybe the thing enjoyed fear. Maybe it never intended to hurt me. If it wanted to attack, it had the opportunity. I was a small child standing beside it in a dark room. It did not grab me. It did not follow me upstairs. It only revealed its face and disappeared. Still, frightening a child deliberately is not harmless. Whatever I saw felt evil. I do not mean it was ugly or strange. The feeling came from the expression and the atmosphere around it. The room became heavy before I saw the face clearly. My body recognized danger before my mind did. The figure's smile seemed full of hostility. There was intelligence behind it. It knew I believed it was my brother. It knew the moment I realized the truth. I was 19 when I began thinking about the experience more seriously. By then, I understood how unreliable childhood memory could be. Years of retelling can add details. Fear can make colors brighter and expressions more extreme. The red eyes may have been reflections from the monitor or something my memory added later. The figure may not have literally faded. The screen could have turned off, leaving me unable to see it. I accept all of that. But I still remember the event vividly. The tapping woke me. My brother's shaped figure stood at the computer. Random symbols filled the login field. I approached. It turned. It was not him. The details have never changed at their center. Even now, the sound of someone typing too hard in a quiet room makes me uncomfortable. Computers are normally ordinary objects. Their sounds mean someone is working, playing, or communicating. That night, the keyboard noise had no purpose except to bring me closer. I also dislike seeing someone from behind in a dark room. There is always a moment before they turn when I wonder whether the face will belong to the body. Most people never question that. You recognize the clothing, hair, and posture, and you assume you know who is standing there. At 7 years old, I learned that recognition could be wrong. I told myself for years that it was a nightmare. That remains the explanation I offer most people. I was young. I was sleeping in an unfamiliar house. The darkness, computer glow, and distance from my brother created a vivid dream. It is logical. It allows the world to remain normal. But whenever I remember the way the figure looked at me, the dream explanation feels incomplete. Dreams can create fear, but this felt like being noticed by something outside myself. The expression did not feel like my own imagination. It felt like a response. The figure had been waiting for me to understand. Then, once I did, it no longer needed the disguise. I never saw it again. Nothing else happened at that house that I know of. My brother and his girlfriend did not report strange activity. The computer did not continue turning on by itself. There were no later sightings of a figure wearing my brother's face. It was one isolated encounter. That makes it impossible to investigate and easy for others to dismiss. I have no proof. There was no photograph, recording, or second witness. Only a frightened 7-year-old awake in a dark living room. Maybe that is all it was. Maybe I woke from a nightmare, became confused, and carried the dream upstairs with me. Maybe my brother briefly used the computer and I misunderstood what happened. Maybe the entire memory changed over the years. I hope one of those explanations is true. But when I think about that night, I do not first remember the red eyes or the strange smile. I remember the moment before it turned. I was standing beside someone I trusted. I was close enough to reach out and touch his arm. I believed I was safe. Then the typing stopped. The head turned slowly toward me. And I understood that whatever had woken me and drawn me across the room had never been my brother at all. For 5 years, I managed the bar at a fine dining Italian restaurant located inside a massive historic building. The place had been built in the late 1800s. It had 2 full stories, a basement, high ceilings, old woodwork, and the kind of architecture that made it obvious the building had lived through several different lives before becoming a restaurant. The main dining room, kitchen, and bar were on the ground floor. The second floor was empty. It contained old rooms that were no longer used for anything. Staff had very little reason to go up there, and most people avoided it unless they absolutely had to. The basement had much more character. In the early 1900s, it had apparently operated as another bar. An old wooden counter still stood down there. It was beaten up and worn from age, but it was beautiful. The wood was thick, dark, and solid, the kind of craftsmanship you rarely see in newer buildings. There was also a boiler room. The boiler room was one of the most unpleasant places in the entire building. It was cramped, dim, and filled with old equipment, pipes, and shadows. Even people who did not believe in ghosts described it as creepy. Just beyond the boiler room were 5 steps leading up to a heavy back door. That door opened into the alley behind the restaurant. The basement was supposed to be used only for storage and building access, but after closing time, the staff sometimes held completely secret and totally illegal parties down there. We would finish work, lock the restaurant, and then gather around the old basement bar. Music would play, people would drink, and for a few hours, the forgotten part of the building would feel alive again. Nothing terrible ever happened during those parties. At least, nothing that made us stop going down there. It is probably important to mention what happened on my first day working at the restaurant. A maintenance man was inside doing several small repair jobs. I had barely started learning the layout when he approached me and another new employee. He looked completely serious. He warned both of us never to go upstairs and never to go into the basement. He said the building was haunted. Not only that, he said someone could get seriously hurt. His tone was not playful. He did not smile afterward or wait for us to become frightened. He said it as though he were giving us a normal workplace safety warning. Naturally, we thought he was crazy. Old buildings always have ghost stories. The pipes knock, the floors creak, doors move because of drafts. People hear noises through walls and decide someone died in the room. We assumed the maintenance man had either frightened himself after working alone or enjoyed scaring new employees. My coworker and I laughed it off and continued with our day. Over the next year, I became completely comfortable in the building. I worked long shifts, stayed late, opened early, and walked through nearly every part of the restaurant. I went into the basement many times. I never saw a ghost. I never heard a voice calling from an empty room. The upstairs remained unused, and the basement remained dark and unpleasant, but neither felt dangerous enough to take the warning seriously. About a year after I started working there, something happened that changed the way I felt about the building. It was late at night, and I was closing the restaurant. I closed alone most nights. By then, I had the process memorized. I worked 5 nights a week and followed the same routine each time. I checked the kitchen. I made sure the ovens and other equipment were shut down. I cleaned and secured the bar. I counted money, checked the dining room, locked the doors, turned off the lights, and prepared the alarm. Because I had done it so often, I could close the entire building almost without thinking. That night was no different. The staff had already left. The kitchen was empty. The dining room was dark and silent. Every chair had been pushed in, every table had been cleared, and the restaurant looked exactly as it should after closing. My final task was always to blow out a pair of candles at the hostess stand. The candles sat inside an antique glass holder shaped like an angel. The decoration stood only a few feet from the main entrance. During business hours, the candlelight reflected through the glass. and gave the front of the restaurant a warm appearance. At closing, they had to be extinguished before I left. I walked over and blew them out. I remember doing it clearly. Both flames disappeared. The wicks glowed red for a moment, and thin streams of smoke rose inside the glass. I watched long enough to make sure the candles did not relight. Then I went to the alarm panel. I entered the code and armed the system. The alarm accepted it. That meant, as far as the system was concerned, every monitored exterior door was closed. I stepped outside through the main entrance and pulled the door shut behind me. Then I locked it. Before walking away, I glanced through the glass one final time. The candles in the angel holder were burning, both of them. The flames were steady and bright inside the dark restaurant. I stood outside, staring through the door. My first reaction was confusion. I knew I had blown them out. I had seen the smoke. There was no question in my mind that the flames had been gone when I set the alarm. For a few seconds, I tried to think of a normal explanation. Maybe one candle had not gone out fully. A small ember could have caught the wick again. Perhaps a draft moved through the glass holder and caused the flame to return. But both candles were burning. They did not look weak or newly relit. They looked exactly as they had during business hours. I was frightened, but I also considered myself a rational person. I did not believe in ghosts. I was not going to leave two lit candles inside a locked, historic building simply because something felt strange. A fire would have been far more dangerous than any supposed haunting. I unlocked the entrance. The alarm began its entry countdown, and I quickly entered the code to disarm it. The restaurant became silent again. I walked to the hostess stand. The candles continued burning as I approached them. There was no one else inside. No employee had hidden after closing. No customer had been overlooked. I leaned toward the angel holder and blew the candles out a second time. This time, I watched them carefully. The flames disappeared. The wicks darkened. Smoke curled upward. I waited. Nothing relit. I checked the surrounding area to make sure there was no strange airflow or another source of flame. Everything looked normal. I told myself I must have failed to extinguish them properly the first time. Maybe the glass holder trapped enough heat for the wicks to catch again. It was strange, but not impossible. I returned to the alarm panel and entered the code. The system refused to arm. Instead of showing the normal confirmation, the screen displayed a warning. Check basement back door. I stared at it. The basement back door was the one beyond the boiler room, up the 5 small steps, leading into the alley. The alarm would not activate if that door was open. That was how the system was designed. The problem was that the alarm had already armed successfully only minutes earlier. The basement door had been closed then. If it had been open, even slightly, the system would have refused to set the first time. I had not gone into the basement. No one else was inside the restaurant. Yet after I returned to extinguish the relit candles, the basement door was suddenly showing as open. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. My heart started beating hard enough that I could feel it in my chest. I looked toward the dark dining room and imagined someone moving through it. The most logical explanation was an intruder. Maybe someone had entered through the basement door after I left. Perhaps the door had not latched properly and had drifted open. A person from the alley could have noticed it and slipped inside. If someone was hiding downstairs, I was now alone in the building with them. That possibility should have been easier to accept than anything supernatural. It was also more immediately dangerous. I considered leaving. I could have locked the front door and called the police. But I did not know whether the basement door was wide open or only slightly ajar. I was responsible for securing the restaurant. I also could not activate the alarm while the system detected an open door. I knew I had to check it. The thought of going into the basement alone terrified me. The maintenance man's warning came back to me. On my first day, he had told us not to go upstairs or into the basement because the building was haunted and someone could be hurt. For a year, I had treated that as nonsense. Standing beside the alarm panel, I suddenly remembered every word. I pulled out my phone and called a close friend who also worked at the restaurant. She did not answer. I left her a voicemail. I told her exactly what was happening. I explained that I had blown out the candles, locked the restaurant, seen them burning again, returned inside, and now the alarm was telling me the basement back door was open. I told her I was going downstairs to check it. The reason I called was not because I expected her to arrive and help me. All I could think was that if I disappeared, someone should know where to look. That thought made the situation feel even more serious. I stood near the top of the basement stairs and looked down. The basement was only dimly lit. We did not leave every light on after hours, and the few bulbs that remained created large areas of shadow. From the staircase, I could see part of the old bar and the open floor beyond it. The boiler room and alley door were farther back. Nothing moved. I listened for footsteps or voices. I heard only the normal mechanical sounds of the building. The boiler made faint noises. Pipes clicked. Somewhere, an appliance hummed. I turned on whatever lights were available and started descending. Every step took me farther from the front entrance. I kept thinking about the possibility of someone waiting near the boiler room. If an intruder had opened the basement door, they could be hiding behind the old bar, inside the boiler room, or in one of the darker corners. I had no weapon. No one knew for certain that I was still in the building except the friend whose voicemail I had reached. The basement felt much larger than it did during staff parties. With music and coworkers, it was only an old room. Alone at night, it felt like a forgotten part of the building that had been waiting for everyone else to leave. I reached the bottom of the stairs. The old hardwood bar stood in the dim light. I looked behind it as I passed. No one was there. I moved quickly across the basement. I did not walk slowly or investigate every noise. I almost ran. The boiler room was ahead of me. Its doorway looked black. I hated passing it because I could not see every part of the room at once. Pipes and machinery created too many places for a person to hide. I kept my eyes forward and moved past it. The 5 steps leading to the alley door appeared. At the top, the door was visible. It was open slightly. Not wide enough for someone to walk through without moving it, but clearly not fully closed. A narrow line of darkness from the alley showed between the door and the frame. The alarm had been correct. The door was ajar. I stopped several feet away. I listened. There was no sound from outside. No footsteps in the alley. No voices. The door did not move. I climbed the steps. Every part of me expected someone to pull it open from the other side. I reached out, grabbed the door, and looked briefly into the alley. It appeared empty. I did not see anyone running away. There was no object blocking the frame and no obvious reason it had opened. I pulled the door closed firmly. I tested it to make sure the latch caught. It did. I pulled the handle again. The door remained shut. I did not stay to inspect the boiler room or search the rest of the basement. The moment I knew the door was secure, I turned and ran. I went down the 5 steps, crossed the basement, past the old bar, and climbed the main staircase as quickly as I could. I could feel the darkness behind me. I expected the basement door to open again. I imagined footsteps following across the floor. I thought I might hear the old bar creak or the boiler room door move. Nothing happened, but I did not slow down. When I reached the ground floor, I returned directly to the alarm panel. I entered the code. This time, the system armed normally. No warning appeared. The basement door was secure. I walked to the main entrance. I did not look at the angel candle holder. I knew it stood only a few feet away. I could have turned my head and checked whether the candles were still out. I refused. If they were burning again, I did not know what I would do. I had already gone back once. I had already walked into the basement because of the open door. I was not willing to repeat the entire process. I left the building, locked the entrance, and walked away without looking through the glass. As far as I know, the restaurant did not burn down. The candles must have remained out, or someone else dealt with them later. I only knew that I was finished for the night. Nothing exactly like that ever happened to me again during the rest of my time working there. I continued managing the bar. I closed the restaurant many more times. I still went into the basement when necessary, and the staff continued holding secret parties there. But I never felt completely relaxed in the building after that night. Whenever I extinguished the candles, I watched the wicks until they were cold. Whenever I armed the alarm, I checked the screen carefully. If I had to walk near the basement door, I remembered finding it open after the system had already confirmed it was closed. No one believed the full story. Some coworkers laughed and said the candles had simply relit themselves. That can happen. A wick may continue glowing after the flame is blown out. If enough heat remains, the vapor can ignite again. It is unusual, but physically possible. Maybe I did not notice that both candles were still smoldering. Maybe they relit before I reached the door. That explanation is reasonable. The basement door could also have had a faulty latch. Perhaps it was fully closed when I first set the alarm, but not secured tightly. A draft from the alley or pressure change from opening the main entrance may have pulled it open afterward. Old buildings shift. Doors that appear latched may move when temperatures change. The alarm system might have briefly read the sensor incorrectly. Those explanations account for both events separately. The timing is what still bothers me. The alarm armed successfully. I went outside. I saw the candles burning. I returned and extinguished them. Then the alarm reported that a basement door had opened. It felt as though something had drawn me back inside and then forced me to go deeper into the building. First, the candles. Then the door. The angel holders stood near the safest exit. The basement door stood at the farthest, darkest point I had to check. If something wanted me to walk through the entire building alone, that sequence worked perfectly. I do not claim that was intentional. Objects malfunction. Candles relight. Old doors drift open. Two unusual events can happen within minutes without being connected. But in the moment, they felt connected. I have also wondered whether a person entered the basement. Someone could have opened the alley door after I armed the alarm. Maybe the system's exit delay had not completed. Or perhaps the door opened after the alarm was already set, but before the exterior siren activated. An intruder might have heard me return through the front and fled before I reached the basement. That would explain the open door. It would not explain why there was no alarm entry warning when the door moved, unless the system had not fully armed or the sensor was faulty. It also does not explain the candles. Maybe a staff member remained inside without my knowledge. Someone could have relit them as a joke, then escaped through the basement. But I had checked the restaurant. The building was locked. No one later admitted doing it. A prank that required hiding in a dark historic building after closing, relighting candles, and opening an alarm door would have been elaborate and dangerous. The staff enjoyed frightening one another, but this did not feel like one of their jokes. The maintenance man's warning remained in my mind. I sometimes wondered what he had seen. Why had he been so specific? He did not merely say the building had ghosts. He warned us not to go upstairs or into the basement because someone could seriously get hurt. Maybe he knew about physical problems in the building. Old floors, bad wiring, unstable stairs, and dangerous machinery could injure someone. Calling the place haunted may have been his dramatic way of keeping employees away from unsafe areas. But he had sounded afraid. I never asked him for the full story. By the time I wanted to, I no longer knew how to contact him. Other employees had stories about the building, too. People heard footsteps upstairs when the floor was empty. Some felt watched near the basement bar. Objects occasionally seemed misplaced. Most incidents were vague and easy to dismiss. Mine involved things I could verify. The candles were out, then lit. The alarm armed, then reported an open door. The door was physically ajar when I reached it. Those facts were enough. I cannot prove why they happened. I can only describe the sequence. I was alone. The restaurant was dark. I blew out the candles. I armed the alarm and locked the entrance. When I looked through the glass, the flames were burning again. I returned inside and extinguished them. Then the alarm told me to check the basement back door. The same door it had accepted as closed only minutes earlier. I left a voicemail because I was afraid I might disappear. Then I walked into the basement alone. The door was open. I shut it and ran. The most unsettling detail is not even the relit candles or the open basement door. It is the way the entire experience seemed to move me from one location to another. The candles drew me back through the front entrance. The alarm sent me downstairs. The open door waited beyond the boiler room at the far end. Each step took me farther from the street and deeper into the oldest part of the building. Nothing attacked me. I did not see a figure. I did not hear a voice. But I felt as if I were being led. Maybe fear created that feeling afterward. The events may have been random mechanical problems that happened in the worst possible order. That is probably the explanation a rational person should accept. I still consider myself rational. I still do not automatically believe every old building is haunted. But that night frightened me more than any obvious ghost story could have. There was no shadow to blame on poor lighting. No strange face to dismiss as imagination. There were only 2 candles I knew I had extinguished, and a door the security system had already confirmed was closed. I sometimes think about the last moment before I left. The angel candle holder was only a few feet away. I deliberately kept my eyes forward. Part of me was certain that if I looked through the door after locking it, I would see the flames burning again. Maybe they were. I will never know. I did not look back.
The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.